You've been searching for the best way to generate passive income in your life and heard that real estate is a great way to do it. But you're tired of all the so-called gurus who are all talk and no substance. Get ready to celebrate because Kevin Buck has spent 14 years successfully making it happen. This is the Real Estate Investing for Cash Flow podcast. Now, here's Kevin Buck.
Hey guys, Kevin Buck here, and I want to welcome you to another episode of the Real Estate Investing for Cash Flow podcast. Our mission is to help you build and maintain massive amounts of cash flow through income-producing real estate investments. Now, our guest for this week's show is the legend himself, Francis Greenburger, CEO and chairman of Time Equities Inc. Now, Time Equities Inc. currently holds in its portfolio approximately 31.1 million square feet of residential, industrial, office, and retail property, including over 4,000 multifamily apartment units. Now, in addition, Time Equities is in various stages of development and pre-development of constructing approximately 1.4 million square feet of various property types, which includes at least 1,500 residential units. Now, with properties in 30 states, 5 Canadian provinces, Germany, the Netherlands, and Antigua, Time Equities' portfolio benefits from a diversity of property type sizes and markets. Now, Francis has been at this game for more than 50 years, and he did his very first deal before even graduating high school. And get this, guys, his first deal was a New York City office building. Now, if that doesn't impress you, then I don't know what does. And so I'm super excited to get onto the show with Francis. But before we do, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. Like I do each and every week, I like to share my one personal and one professional best from the prior week. Now, the one personal best. One personal best here. I'm all about health and fitness. If you guys have listened to my show for quite some time, you know I'm really into cycling and running and just really living a healthy lifestyle. But, I tend to fall off the wagon every once in a while. And throughout the years, I have going on and off different types of plant-based, vegan, or vegetarian diets. And this past week, I made it one full week of going entirely plant-based, and I'm feeling absolutely great. So I'm going to try to stay on this wagon for at least a number of months, if not the entirety of the year. I know that it's a much healthier lifestyle, much cleaner lifestyle. I have way more energy when I eat this way versus having, steaks and chicken and lots of different processed foods. Again, I'm pretty conscious of my diet even when I was eating meat, and so nothing wrong with it. If you're a meat eater, that's fine. But plant-based has always made me feel so much better, energy-wise, emotional, stamina, all the above. So anyway, made an entire week, and so hopefully you'll hear an update in a couple months from now, and I'll tell you that I made it a number of months following this fairly strict lifestyle. Now, moving on here to the professional best. As you guys probably already heard, I recently got invited back to the Best Ever Conference, which is going to be held in Keystone this year. It normally is in Denver, but it's in Keystone this year. And this is the conference that Joe Fairless puts on. It's going to be February 21st and the 22nd. And as a valued listener of the show, you can use the code BUP15. Again, that's my last name, BUP. And then 15 when registering to get 15% off the ticket price. Now, this is going to be my third year that I've attended the conference. And if you find yourself on the fence about whether or not you should go, I'd highly suggest you attend. Tons of great speakers, a great lineup. Go look at their schedule on their website. And if you come, I'll even buy you a beer if you come up and introduce yourself, okay? So if you attend, make sure you come find me. Let me know who you are, and let me buy you a beer or a drink, coffee, what have you. In addition to the conference, one of the things I'm also excited about is I just decided to fly my wife and my two boys out to the resort so that we can get some quality time on the slopes together. Now, we've already signed Jackson and Julian up for ski lessons. If you recall, they're 3. Julian's 3 and Jackson is 6. So we signed them up for lessons. My hopes are that after a few days on the slopes and getting lessons, they absolutely fall in love with the sport and share the same passion that my wife and I do. My wife and I go skiing each and every year, and I'm very much looking forward to turning it into a family adventure each and every year. Up until this point, it's typically just an adult trip, and so I'd like to convert it to more of a family trip here moving forward. So hopefully they fall in love with it. Moving on here, guys, if you love what we're doing here at the Real Estate Investing for Cash Flow podcast, please be sure to subscribe to the show and also leave a review and rating. That is how we attract awesome guests to the show, and that's how we will continually work to expand the show. So please, the review is incredibly important. Go leave that if you haven't done so already. Lastly, guys, just want to remind you of the free 30-minute phone call that I offer each and every Friday, where you can jump on the horn with me for 30 minutes uninterrupted to talk about anything and everything your heart desires about real estate investing. You can go to my website, kevinbupp.com, to sign up for that call. Just one disclaimer: you must include detailed notes of what you'd like to discuss during our call together. If you do not, then I will cancel the call, okay? I want to make sure that we spend our time as efficiently as possible together. So be sure to include notes when making that appointment. And now, guys, without further ado, let's get on to the part of the show that you've been waiting for, which is our interview with Francis Greenburger. So here we go. Guys, it is my honor to introduce my guest for today's show, the legendary developer, best-selling author, chairman, and CEO of Time Equities Inc., Francis Greenburger. Francis, how you doing today?
Great. So good to be on your show.
Yeah, thanks for joining us here. I was very much looking forward to this show here, and in fact, we had one of your associates. He was on a couple of months back, Max Pastor. It was a phenomenal interview with Max, and I kindly asked Max if he would help arrange this, and he did. He made the magic happen. So again, very much been looking forward to having you here on the show. And Francis, what I'd love to do is for those folks that might not be familiar with your story, your background, Time Equities in general, give you a few minutes to share a high level background of, ultimately, what you've done over the years and maybe from the start as well of how you got into real estate.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking about that. Mine is a little bit of an unusual story. I started when I was extremely young. I started when I was 16 years old. Slowly, step by step, over the last 50 years, the company has grown and is now quite large. Today, we're a national and international company. We own property in 33 states in the U.S., but we also own property in Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and we're always keeping our eyes open. Time Equities is also very diversified in terms of the types of projects that we take on. We own all property types except hotels, so office, industrial, retail, multifamily. A lot of what we own is an existing portfolio, over 30 million square feet, approximately 300 buildings. Mm-hmm. But we also develop new buildings. And in fact, we're building one in Florida today.
What part of Florida is that in?
It's in West Palm Beach.
Okay. Is that luxury residences or what type?
It's luxury 300 rental units.
Okay. Fantastic. Now, I don't want to breeze over kind of your humble beginnings. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were 16 years old when you syndicated your very first deal. And if I can recall, I believe it was an office building in New York City, correct?
Well, actually, my first two ventures into real estate were probably 3 or 4 were office buildings. But those I did more with my own very limited funds in a special way, which is that rather than buying the buildings, I leased them from the owners, so I didn't have to have a down payment. Mm-hmm. And that permitted me to use tiny bit of capital that I had to get those going. But then finally I felt ready to buy my first building. And it was a building, actually, a apartment house located in Greenwich Village in New York. Mm-hmm. And there I turned to some good old family and friends to put together the equity that I needed. And that's how I got started in my very first actual buying of real estate.
Did you come from a real estate family?
No, not at all. My father was in the publishing business. Mm-hmm. He was a literary agent, essentially a solopreneur. My mother helped him a little bit, and maybe he had sort of one part-time employee. Mm-hmm. And I started working with him when I was really after school when I was 12 years old. I started doing some bookkeeping, light bookkeeping for him and things like that, and worked with him until I got more involved in my real estate things.
And how were they accepting when you're at this young age? You essentially taking down these large types of properties. Even the first couple of deals you did, I know that you went in with a lease, so not a lot of capital, not a huge amount of risk, I guess. I don't know exactly what that lease looked like. However, not coming from a real estate background, a real estate family, was this quite shocking to them?
Well, the very first landlord that I dealt with, or that I took a master lease from, was a very nice guy, and he just liked me. I had the benefit of appearing older than I was, and somehow having these sort of innate business instincts. And I had worked in my father's office really from the time I was 12 until 16. So I had developed a certain amount of business acumen when I went into this first master lease deal. But I think it was a combination of, this was very secondary space that the owner didn't want to be bothered with. And plus he liked me. Ultimately, he became my first investor. Because after we did that, he said, well, if you find some building that you need some money for, let me know, and maybe I'll be your partner, which then turned out to be the case in a whole series of transactions. But at first, it was just based on his need of leasing this somewhat secondary space, not wanting to be bothered with small tenants, which was the burden I was going to take on, as well as my impressing him, even though I was very young.
So just to give the listeners some clarity here, basically you went in with a master lease. There was some vacant space in the building, and you felt fairly confident that you could find a good user for that space. And so you took over the master lease based on probably the already existing space that was leased. However, you had a good amount of vacancies that you could fill in and capitalize on and somewhat arbitrage. Is that correct?
Well, the first step was even more micro than that. I had a couple of ancillary book businesses that I had set up while working for my dad. And I needed an office for those. And I looked around, and this owner had two rooms vacant, not one. I only needed one. But he said to me, look, I don't want to bother renting the second office, so I'm going to give you a good deal on both of them, and you'll go out and find somebody to rent the second office from you. And just by coincidence, that afternoon or the next day, I bumped into somebody in a bookstore that a friend and partner of mine owned, and the guy was looking for an office. And I brought him over, and he rented it, and he paid the total rent that I was paying for the two rooms. So I got my first office for free. Then, as other vacancies occurred in the building, the owner, who got to know me, said, look, I don't want to be dealing with these one-room tenants or two-room tenants. I'm going to rent to you each vacant space that comes up, and you'll go do your thing. And that's how it eventually developed into a master lease for the upper floors in this building.
That's beautiful. The beautiful time when opportunity meets preparation, right?
or naivete, depending on how you look at it.
Hey.
But needless to say, it worked out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'd love to, to go stay back in time a little bit. There was a period, I don't know, maybe you can fill in the blanks here, but there was a period many years back where you earned the moniker of the co-op king of New York. And that was for converting pre-war apartment buildings into owner-occupant residences. And it was a period where you were able to essentially offer these tenants the ability to buy or invest in their very own home and really create a path to wealth for these different families. So I'd love to hear about that. Was that one of your, what you perceive to be one of the big breaks where you started really making a name for yourself?
Yes, I think that took me from a small to medium-sized scale to a much larger scale. And this was a particular time in the history of New York rent regulation where we still had an overhang of rent controls, really dating back to World War II. Mm-hmm. And so the situation in New York was that a lot of housing was rented at below market rents, way below market rents. And the tenants had the right to remain in their spaces in perpetuity under the law. But one of my things I used to say to people when they asked me why they should buy their apartments instead of stay as renters, I said, well, rent control is great, but you can't take it with you. Mm. And what that meant was that tenants, in essence, as having a life estate on their apartments, as long as they stayed there, they were fine. But if they wanted to move to Florida, for instance, mm-hmm. there was no way for them to monetize their tenant equity. And the conversion market essentially spoke to that. So we took these buildings that were covered by rent regulation, and we went to the tenants and said, look, we're going to sell you your apartments for 40% less than the value today. So if you buy your apartment, let's say the apartment's worth $100,000, you buy it today for $60,000, you can sell it tomorrow morning for $100,000. And you know it because every broker will tell you that. And in fact, we could document to them that was the market. So it was a good deal for them, and it was a good deal for us because the buildings subject to rent regulation might only have been worth $25,000 mm-hmm. So we were getting a big markup on the value, and the tenants were monetizing their life estate equity, so to speak. The other thing that was happening was, as part of that process, money was going into these buildings mm-hmm. to make them, improve them because of the constraints of rents. Owners didn't have a lot of economic incentive or possibility to fix the buildings up. So many of them had deferred maintenance, and so that was part of the process. And the last part was that banks said, well, you're buying your apartment for 40% off the market. We lend people who come in here up to 75% of the value of their apartment. So we'll actually give you 100% of the purchase price.
Oh my gosh.
We'll recognize your tenant equity as being as good as a 40% down payment, which is more than most people get. So it was a win-win-win, and it became a major movement in New York, and we were one of the 2 or 3 leaders in that movement. And in the course of maybe 6 years, I went from, I think the first building I converted had 5 apartments. The last one that I converted, which was a complex, had about 2,300 units.
Wow.
And in that period of time, we converted over 100 buildings containing a total of about 10,000 units.
That's amazing.
So this was a massive business. I just was in the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm. No, that's absolutely beautiful. And so that was about a 6-year run. Was there something that ultimately came to a head at the end of that 6 years to where that was no longer a viable opportunity?
Yeah. People who didn't really understand the business, as sometimes happens in real estate markets, felt, oh, this is easy. Well, it wasn't. And they misjudged the profit and loss calculation. And even some very large, sophisticated people who frankly should have known better. And the price of the raw buildings escalated mm-hmm. dramatically.
Yeah.
And in a particular point in time, I would say within a year, prices more than doubled. Maybe went up 150%. Because so many people thought, oh, well, we can make a lot of money doing it. Mm-hmm. And so, as I put it, leather costs more than shoes, and therefore we could no longer. I didn't want to go on, and ultimately, it was clear that one would lose money or not make any. And unfortunately, some of these other people that came into the business not fully understanding it, there were some gigantic bankruptcies that occurred among some of our competitors, and we were lucky because we said basta when the prices ran away with themselves.
Yeah, I mean, quickly squeezing margins, getting really small. Everyone's making a mad dash to purchase as fast as they can, and ultimately, you never want to be the last guy, in the game of musical chairs, right? The last guy
exactly. And I think in the real estate lesson that I learned out of all of this is that I'm not a market buyer or a momentum buyer because Harry paid a certain price for a property. I'm not going to buy it for that price or more. I'm only going to buy things that when I do the numbers, they make sense to me. Because the condition that I described in New York in this particular market niche has existed in many markets. It's happened in Florida. It's happened in lots of places. So you really have to stick to your own vision of a business plan and make sure that there are sufficient margins. Otherwise, you might be caught in a wave, and as you put it, there will be no chairs left.
Yeah, I remember there being a huge run, 2002, 3, 4, 5, leading up to the Great Recession there, and I would have to guess that those failed condominium projects, apartment conversions to condominiums were probably the primary driver behind many of the multifamily defaults that ultimately occurred as a result of 2008. I would think. I know there was a litany of them here in Florida that just never made it, past the conversion stage, or if they did, it was a little too late. There were no buyers there for that end condo unit product, right? So, quite interesting.
The condominium market is a unusual market because unlike the rental market where demand is pretty consistent, when condominium buyers sense that it's a good moment in the market, they come out and buy a lot of apartments. But the market almost has a sixth sense, and when they feel prices are getting too far ahead of themselves, or when certain conditions change, the market can go cold in a very short period of time. And that's essentially what happened in 2005 and 2006, leading into the financial collapse. And yes, condominium developers were a big part of that problem. And the banks, there were some key banks that were backing a lot of these things, and they went bankrupt ultimately.
I'd love to get your perspective on, rent control in New York. I know that, that's what these pre-war apartment buildings that you were converting into condos. That's where part of that value was actually converting them into owner-occupied residences versus rent-controlled buildings. New York has been through just an ongoing evolution of rent control policies. More recently, a couple months ago, that changed once again. What are your thoughts on today's rent policy, how that affects your current holdings there in the city that are multifamily properties, and do you see it actually continuing to get more strict, or do you think there'll be a point in time where we go the opposite direction in New York?
Well, I could spend 2 hours just talking about this subject. You'll not be surprised to hear. I think the red legislation that got passed while in the middle of the night, while nobody was looking.
We own New York real estate as well, so that's why I'm very familiar with it.
It's one of the most dramatic I call it a black swan event in New York City real estate. The legislation was as far-reaching as can be imagined. I say that, but it covered a certain segment of apartments, about 1.5 million apartments. But there are far more in New York, and there is sentiment among some of the more extreme rent control advocates to extend these policies beyond the 1.5 million apartments that are covered by it. Personally, I've tried to look at this from a public policy point of view. And not only is this clearly a terrible law for landlords and owners, I think it will not achieve the policymakers' goals. And there are a number of reasons for that. But I'll start with the most obvious. When you lower the price of anything, a sweater in a store, at $100, there are 5 people who want to buy it. At $10, there are 20 people or 30 people who want to buy it. So we have a condition in New York where we already had too much demand for what's called affordable housing. And that's the public policy issue that policymakers were trying to address. But when this law passed, they really expanded demand for these apartments, because now every college student who's in a roommate situation says, well, for this lower price, I'll get my own apartment. Everybody who's out of town and visits New York frequently says, well, if I can get a pied-à-terre for $500 or $750 or $1,000 a month, sign me up. Everybody in a college dorm, the same thing. So they increased the demand, but they haven't increased the supply. In New York, there's a whole group, and I think it's true, who described this legislation as a taking by government of these apartments. And it was an indiscriminate taking in the sense that they just grabbed whatever they could in this basket. But it's also an indiscriminate allocation. So a more straightforward way to do what they have done would have been to condemn or buy the apartments that they want. Of course, if they condemn it, they have to pay for it pursuant to our Constitution, both federally as well as New York. And then they could have allocated it on a need basis to families that have low incomes or were really within that affordable need group. But now they've opened it up to the entire world, which is why I say that it's actually going to have the reverse effect of what was intended. There's more and more demand for these very few apartments, and no new apartments are being built as a result. And in fact, the law will discourage new production of housing, because developers, including myself, will say, well, why do I want to be in this place where they pass such irrational and inappropriate laws? So I really see it as a very, very negative thing. Have been talking about it to anybody who listen.
Well, yeah, so we're in the manufactured housing space, and this is the first time in history to where it's actually been extended and broadened across, from a statewide perspective, to apply to manufactured housing communities as well. So we've got communities in Western New York that are directly impacted, and ultimately, it's again, we could probably have this conversation for hours upon hours of why it's not a good thing for anyone involved. And I'd love to get your feedback, though, from my perspective. And as the legislation applies to manufactured housing communities, some of the large downsides I see, at least from a long-term perspective, is just the lack of improvement dollars that are available to the landlord to reinvest in his property, to make the necessary capital improvements that are going to be needed 5, 10, 15 years down the road. There's some pretty strict assessment measures, prohibitive assessment measures that are applied to the manufactured housing side of things. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like on the multifamily side, but do you feel that there's going to be a long-term negative effect as it relates to the upkeep of these buildings that are affected by this new rent control legislation?
For sure.
Yeah. Hasn't that played out in history? I mean, hasn't that played out pretty much in
Yes, it did. That's where I started from.
Yeah.
We're back to the same place. A lot of these multifamily apartments in New York have been occupied for very long periods of time. And typically, when the tenants leave under the old law, the improvement, the renovation of those apartments was highly incentivized.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what needs to be done, the renovation of an apartment in New York City can cost anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 if you're redoing plumbing, if you are redoing electric. Many of these apartments have very old electric. And if you're really doing a renovation, which many of them desperately need. And there were proper incentives under the old law for it. Now, they have drastically, they've limited the amount of improvements to $15,000. Well, you can barely renovate a closet for $15,000 in New York City. And the incentives that they give are relative to that $15,000. Basically, instead of letting you get back your money over approximately four years and then a little bit of return, now you have to wait 15 years. It's absurd. And 15 years and you make no return.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an absolutely ridiculous standard. And in my opinion, and as I say, I have a lot of thoughts on this, what that's going to do is mean that these apartments are going to be kept to a minimum legal standard in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And people who move here and go to one of these apartments will say, this is completely substandard. And, New York is driven, and all of our great social policies are paid for by our economic activity and businesses. And the number one thing that all businesses are concerned about today are staff. And part of the reason they come to New York is because there's a good labor pool.
Mm-hmm.
But now people are going to say, well, I'm not moving to New York to live in a place like this. And so we're going to lose our labor availability, and businesses are going to say, I'm not going to New York. And it's a whole vicious cycle that is really, really ill-conceived.
Are there any reactionary measures being taken by those folks that are completely against rent control measures? I mean,
Yes,
what are you seeing at the ground floor?
There are two major. One case has been filed, and another case is already is in preparation. And these are essentially constitutional challenges.
Yeah.
The one of the cases I think revolves around protections in our constitutions, which says when government takes property from somebody, they have to compensate them. So they're making the argument that this is in fact a taking in the legal sense, and the city has to compensate owners for it.
Yeah.
And then there's another one which takes a different approach, but essentially has a legal basis to attack the extreme conditions of the new law. So both law firms are taking slightly different tacks, but these cases are going to make their way through the courts. Of course, they'll take years.
Sure.
But eventually there'll be a day in court.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I'd love to shift gears if we can, Francis, and I'd love to get your perspective on, kind of where we're at in the market cycle. For literally the last 4 or 5 years, someone's going to get it right sooner or later, but for the last 4 or 5 years, maybe even slightly longer than that, there's been experts from various sides touting about the looming recession or market correction, market crash, whatever you want to call it. But really, the Feds have been playing the, how low can we go game on interest rates, and which typically, continues with a hot real estate market. I mean, what are your thoughts on, truly where we're at in the cycle? And I know it's all relative to the local marketplace, but this, I guess, if you can look at it from a high level perspective, at least from the U.S., I know you're international, but from a U.S. perspective, do you see that there's an end in sight?
Well, listen, we all know we're in a very long recovery cycle, and the history of economic cycles is that they end at some point, and we go into a counter cycle where activity goes down. And there are any number of economic metrics that people have correlated with these turns in the past, and many of them are flashing red right now. So in addition to the simple logic that we've been in this economic recovery for a long time, there are these flashing red economic indicators as well. So there's good reason to believe that the cycle is coming to an end. On the other hand, real estate is a long-term business. And it's not like the stock market where you can call your broker and just sell everything overnight or in a matter of seconds. And different markets, real estate exists in local markets and submarkets. And the characteristics of one submarket versus another may be completely different. In the recession of the 90s, the coasts were hurt most, and the middle of the country, the Midwest, was doing relatively well. Then, in the financial collapse of 2008-10, I would say it was the reverse. The coasts sort of maintained their market pricing, but the Midwest was falling apart. So you have to think in terms of local markets. You have to think in terms of the long-term nature of real estate holdings. And I think if you're going to be involved in real estate investments, you also have to sort of structure yourself in a way that you can ride through cycles without going bankrupt. So that you have to have enough liquidity to deal with capital needs, financial needs, financing needs, and you'll probably make less money in good times. But if you've structured yourself carefully, you'll keep going, and you'll survive until the cycle turns to the positive again. And even in negative cycles, there's positive business to be done, and that's sort of been our history, and it's how we approach things.
Are there different types of projects that you might be starting to steer clear of? I know that you've been involved in the development of very high-end luxury residences, that are owner-occupied residences. Development plays like that. Is that something that you tend to start steering away from at some point during the cycle? If so, when is that?
Well, as an example, the condominium market in New York City has been in a downward. The velocity of condominium sales has declined dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years. So I made a decision a couple of years ago not to undertake any new condominium projects in New York. And now, of course, given the new regulatory environment, I'm kind of not New York oriented at all in terms of new commitments, not surprisingly. But nationally, things are different. We still see strong demand for rental housing in many markets. And in some cases, some condominium projects are developed, and then when they don't work out, they turn into what we call broken condos or rental projects. But another way to approach it is to have a proactive business plan where from day one you say, well, I'm going to sell a certain part of these and I'm going to rent the rest. And that's an approach that we're using in at least one project. So right now we're in our new developments. We're rental oriented, but where we're in markets where there's still condominium interest and low availability, we will cautiously take advantage of that.
Got it. That makes sense. Now, I know that you've had some dealings. I don't know what they are. I'd love to hear about them. But you've had some. I'm assuming business dealings with our president. In the real estate world. So Donald Trump, and I'd love to hear about it if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I have not had business dealings.
Okay, got it.
With Donald Trump, I have met him on a couple of occasions at industry events. Ironically, the first time I met him was in an emergency political meeting, because in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan proposed the same kind of tax law change that Trump ultimately, the so-called SALT, or the lack of state deductibility, state tax deductibility. But in the early 80s, when I first met Trump, he was at the table with me and other real estate owners in New York, contributing money to stop Ronald Reagan's proposal. Of course, it's the very proposal that, when he became president, he did a complete 360 on, and negatively impacted a lot of the larger states. We all know who they are, and we also know how they voted. So,
right.
Anyway, and one other occasion that I interacted with him at an industry event. But I have not done any business. I have heard stories, of course, from people who have done business with him. And, I don't have to go there, but you've read about them in the press. And,
Sure.
He's had a complex history.
To say the least. I'd love to hear about your book, and we're going to plug it here at the end of the show and let folks know, how they can get a copy of it. We're on Amazon, but I went to search for the audio version of it. It wasn't there, but so I'm going to have to physically read it. And I was hoping to do that before we did our interview. Max had told me a great deal about it, kind of the plot of the entirety of the story. But I'd love from your perspective maybe to share a little bit about really what the catalyst was of writing that book, and what our listeners can expect if they grab a copy.
Well, I would say that the book, I've been involved in a number of different activities in my life simultaneously. So as I mentioned, my father was in the publishing business. I worked with him till I was 16, but he died when I was 21. And I took over his really one-person business and then developed it. And it still exists today, and there are about 25 people who work there, and it's an important part of that industry. So there's stuff about my publishing life. There's a lot about my real estate life. But I also spend a lot of time on not-for-profit activities. And I basically focus on the arts, education, and criminal justice reform. And 2-3 very different areas. But I have major involvements in all of them, and so to some degree I discuss those. So it's really the story of my life and who I am and how I got here. My impetus for writing it was really twofold. One, I had several very, very significant mentors in my life, and that helped me along particularly my business career. And I felt that I wanted to talk about them in writing the book, and in a sense pay homage to them, because they were such pivotal, important factors in my development. And then the second thing was that my mother actually had written a book about her war years, and I saw how it not only resonated with me, but even someone like my wife, who's French, and her parents, who are French and they live in France. And it's sort of a good part of the book takes place in France. So it sort of continued the family connection and history. And of course, my kids have all read it. So there's something about carrying forward one's life experience and family history to one's kids. And then, of course, there's the broad world who might be interested in things that you've done and lessons learned and all of that sort of thing. And I must say that the book has had a very good reception. I think I've received over 500 letters from people who read it, and they all told me that it was important to them, so much so that they took the time to write to me. So, I feel like it was a very worthwhile thing to do.
If you could simply make a positive impact on just one life, you're winning, right? I mean, and the fact that
that's the way I feel for sure.
Huge. That's huge. That's wonderful. I love that. Well, Francis, you've shared a lot of great information here today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. And I'd like to enter in what I call the Golden Nugget segment of the show. And this is where we're going to, work to round things out. And what I'd like to ask of you is if you just had one final Golden Nugget of advice or wisdom that you could leave with our listeners today that may inspire and motivate them as they progress in their real estate or business career, what would that one last Golden Nugget be?
Well, I guess I look at the world as always changing. Some people try to resist change or to isolate themselves from it. That's not possible. So I think if you can develop your business and develop your point of view, understanding that you're going to have to adapt to changing circumstances all the time, that's sort of the best defense that you can have against adverse change that will undoubtedly affect all of us. And one of the strategies that I have in order to do that is I've always had a very diversified approach to my real estate investments. So I can't tell you where the next fire is going to be, or the next drought, or the next major employer who closes down and affects the region in a dramatic way. So knowing that these unpredictable changes are coming, and that I'm not smart enough to predict, I try to stay diversified and know that on average, I'm going to be able to correct my problems, pay for whatever damage occurs, and go forward.
So diversification is that the key. I mean, that's really the moral of that story is there. So one property in one region might have a negative impact. For example, New York, maybe some of your multifamily properties, to where your properties in the Midwest might prop them up during a downtime. So that's fantastic. Well, Francis, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on here. Folks, if you'd like to learn more about Francis and his firm, it's timeequities.com. Again, timeequities.com. And please go grab a copy of his book. You can get it on Amazon. The book is titled Risk Game, Self-Portrait of an Entrepreneur. And again, that's Francis Greenburger. Francis, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story with us and just giving us some insights to the last 50 plus years of Time Equities and basically what you built from scratch up to a very large international company. It's just
well, Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me, and I appreciate it.
Congratulations! Now you've got more of the best tricks of the trade in building massive amounts of passive income from real estate. For more amazing resources, visit realestateinvestingforcashflow.com. And we'll see you next Monday morning.